This is going to be a tough one to do without spoilers, but I'll do my best. You're too young to realise it yet, but if you start the book again, we'll all be back. I once sat behind Gene Wolfe at an SF convention, and I've never been somebody who's easily awed by writers. I've talked to loads of my heroes, as you know if you watch a channel, but I just didn't know what to say to Gene Wolfe, so I didn't approach him. It was one of those moments where you could just think to yourself, I'm sitting behind Gene Wolfe, and that was enough. I've always found Gene Wolfe to be a divisive figure in my mind, and I can never decide whether he's fabulously overrated or whether he is hit and miss because he's a genius or was close to being a genius and he experimented, and whether it's just sometimes that the experiments didn't work. So today I want to talk about The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories, which is one of the stories in that collection there, which, as you'll notice, is called The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories and Other Stories. That's not a typo, it's because the opening story in the collection is called The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories. And it's not just called that because it's a gimmick, because The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories is a story about a multi-level story, or a series of tiers of a story which come together and really linger in the mind. The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories is sometimes described as the first of Wolfe's Archipelago series, because what he did with that basic title, The Island of Dr. Death, is he swapped the words around, so he got 3 different variants out of it, like a little sort of literary game. And they're all good stories, but the first one is my favourite, even though it's the second one that won the Nebula. And I've reread it a number of times in the last few weeks as I've been making my way through this collection. As I said at the beginning, I find Wolfe divisive to my way of thinking, because sometimes he really nails it and other times he doesn't, and I don't know whether it's just me or whether I'm not clever enough or he's too clever for his own good, but I've often found his writing quite diffuse, and he's not somebody who info dumps a heck of a lot, and that can be a good thing, but it can be a failing as well. And the whole argument about should you show not tell, I think in a lot of the great SF stories there's a lot to be said for the telling, or a combination of showing and telling. In the contemporary way we do things, it's all about the showing. But does that always work as well? The protagonist of the tale is a young boy called Tackman Babcock. He's known as Tacky to the people who live with him. And he lives in a rundown former hotel, which is on a peninsula that juts out into a lake in an unsort of disclosed part of North America. And it's winter time, and we see him at the beginning by the lake, and Wolfe has this sentence which introduces the concept that in the winter even the water is different. Winter comes to water as well as land, though there are no leaves to fall. This is the deceptively simple prose that Wolfe uses. There's nothing flowery in terms of the actual vocabulary, but the sentence itself is immediately more complex than it seems, invoking the fact that things are colder, but he doesn't say it directly. Instead of saying the water is colder in winter, he says something a little bit more bleak. He is living at home with his mother, who's a remote figure who seems to have some sort of illness, and his mother's younger lover, Jason. These are characters who are drawn very sort of sparsely, very sort of swiftly, but you kind of get the archetype straight away, and that's the strength of Wolfe's writing. And you can tell this is a child with a problem, this quasi-absent mother. His father has split up with his mother. There's this young lover who is quite happy to say to Tacky that he finds Tacky's mum very warm and soft, and there's something sort of unhealthy about the whole milieu. Clearly Tacky is alone and a loner, and he doesn't seem to be at school, and there's some sort of holiday coming up, and there is a sequence in the story where there's a party in the house, and he is taken down to the local town by Jason, who has a Jaguar, and he falls asleep in the car, and then he wakes up, and there's the little telling details of small town life. There's a stray dog that won't come to the car even when called. There's a cop wandering around on the sidewalk, and Jason comes back to the car, and Taki says, "Oh please, I want to go in a store. Can we go in a store?" His mother's lover reluctantly agrees to go into the drugstore with Taki, and Taki has a look around, and he comes across a rack spinner, and he pulls a paperback off it, and he goes to Jason and says, "Can I have this, please?" And Jason takes it from him, pops it back in the rack spinner. But back in the car, we realise that Jason has pocketed the book and gives it to the boy. When he gets home, he runs upstairs to read it. The rest of the narrative is interspersed with what Taki is actually reading, and he's reading a book called The Island of Dr. Death, possibly a book called The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories. And we're immersed in that story. The paragraphs indent a little, so we know when we're reading it. And it's a very lurid, pulpy story. It's got a very lurid pulp cover with a monster and a hero who is blonde and tawny and covered in blood. And Taki finds this absolutely marvellous. So you get these indentations where there's the prose from the story, The Island of Dr. Death. Taki escapes from his dreadful real life into the story of The Island of Dr. Death, and the hero is called Ransom, and Dr. Death, of course, is the villain. And Taki immerses himself into this very pulpy story, which is incredibly reminiscent of The Island of Dr. Moreau. What we soon become aware of course, is that this is a story about escapism and reality, and how escapism can protect a child, but at the same time can expose them. Because when you come out of the escapism and you get Taki's joy, and it's not a sort of Bradbury-esque lyrical joy, it's a good deal more fiery than that, and it sparks off in his head. There isn't that level of sentiment. There's just the sheer indulgence in story that Taki is relishing. There are moments in the story where the characters Ransom and Dr. Death step into Taki's reality and emerges with this, and they talk to him, and they talk to him about story. And the ending of the story is particularly moving and fascinating, because this is a metafiction. It's a fiction about fiction, and this is why the story is called The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories. And other stories, because Gene Wolfe wants you to react in sort of three levels. There's the immediate surface story, which is Taki's problem, Taki's world, and what he has to cope with in the split and savaged world that he's entered as his mother's relationship with his father has broken down. Then there's the wonderful phantasmagoric story which he's reading in The Island of Dr. Death. And of course, there's our self-awareness of the story, where we realise that what's happening is Wolfe is questioning why we're seeking to escape, and how in really good fantasy and science fiction, it's about escaping into reality as opposed to from reality. And this is what happens to Taki. The decision Taki makes to talk about what is actually going on in his house leads to a bigger reality, maybe one that as an adult he isn't ready for, because he's not yet an adult. He's going through his adolescence. And the wonderful poignant ending, which underlines the beauty of escapism, but how the only way you can truly escape is into art, and how it will always reveal reality if it's great art. If you start the book again, we will all be there again. You're too young to realise it now. Aside from the incursions of Ransom and Dr. Death into Taki's reality, or seemingly so, there's also a real doctor in the story who is rather ambiguous. Is he really a doctor? To begin with, you're inclined to think and take it on face value that he is. And this is the thing with reading Wolfe. You can't take any of it on face value. He's a very subtle misdirector. And being somebody who likes misdirection and who likes lacunae, gaps coming up in a story which lead you into a different state of consciousness with a conceptual breakthrough, there really is something very subtle about the way that Wolfe does this. And this is why you can't rush reading him ever. There's also a kind of mirroring between the gaze of the author, Gene Wolfe, and Dr. Death in The Island of Dr. Death, in The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories. So there's that level as well. There's that other level of the authorial voice being present. But it's subtly done, because there are moments in the story that Taki is reading where Dr. Death is talking about having made the monsters, which pop up in the pop story, and the question about whether he made them and who makes them. And immediately on a reread, you start thinking about the author's part in creating all this and the levels of the story, the author, the reader, the character, the story within the story. So you are working on at least 4 levels here. And that's the beauty of reading Wolfe. He is somebody who really does deserve close examination and a slow, positive, stately read. There is more to be said about the story. It could stand up against any American short story of that time. The realism, the uncluttered prose, the beautiful and deft evocation of character and place. But Wolfe really takes it to another level. Is it a postmodern story? You could say it is, but in lots of ways it's not. It's a classical story, and Wolfe wasn't afraid to sort of refer to classical themes. If you look at his early works, it's even in the titles. His first novel, Operation Ares, which is about Mars. Of course, that's only slightly classical, but you get the 5th head of Cerberus. So Wolfe was obviously somebody well read, and of course in the Soldier books, Soldier of Arete and Soldier in the Mist, his predecessor, we have a classical situation and a classical setting. There are other fine stories in this collection, which was Wolfe's first collection, and this is the current print-on-demand Orb edition from Tor, which isn't particularly well done. It's not printed very well, I have to say. Wish I still had my sort of Pennington one. There's other wonderful stories in here. Alien Stones, which is a great story. I want to talk about that again. The Hero as Werewolf, another deceptive story, and various others, and I want to come back to that at another point. But as I say, with Wolfe, I find that I have to step back and reread and reconsider and think more. You can't just read him quickly and take what's immediately on the surface. There's always something else for you to sort out. How do I feel overall about The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories? Well, I think the more I read it, the more it becomes a favourite, and my suspicion with Wolfe is that I need to reread more and to think again and to look carefully at each story. And his genius is a more subtle one. He doesn't always use flashy vocabulary and immediate sort of similes that you grasp. He's a bit more subtle than that. So is his diffusion really in the mind of the reader? He's very much a writer that you get more out of him the more you put in. I wouldn't say that's always the case. Some of the stories in this didn't do a lot for me, but you are left with that feeling that it's probably you, not him. So that's my take on that. There will be more on Gene Wolfe on the channel. We're going to look at some more of the early work soon. I know everybody talks about the Book of the New Sun, and we will get to that at some point. There's already loads of videos on YouTube about it, and I'm wondering at this stage whether I can add anything new. I need to reread the latter 3 volumes. I've reread Shadow of the Torturer in recent years. I've read it 3 times. I think I need to go back to the others, but there will certainly be more about Wolfe, particularly on the early work, because I'm revisiting it and finding things I'd never found before, which really is the mark sometimes of a master author and somebody who really has a classic feel. I'd very much like to know what you think of Gene Wolfe and your feelings about him, particularly the short stories and the early work. So please comment below, and hopefully we can open an interesting dialogue about this. I certainly feel that I have more work to do in his oeuvre, and I need to reassess and re-examine and look in more depth. And I have to say, it's been a wonderful experience reading and rereading that story several times over the last few weeks. This is Outlaw Bookseller, signing out for now. Bye.